Cell signaling. Cell signaling, this is a very important topic that we are going to discuss. Cell signaling or cellular communication, this is very important for the cells to perform their activities, to communicate within the cells. As we know, within the cell or outside the cell with other cells. We know very well that like tissues, they are composed of cells and they have a similar function. All the group of cells, all cells which are present inside the group, they perform a single similar function. How do they perform? The basic mechanism behind performing a single function, that is a cell signaling. As well as we know very well that in our body we have hormones. Those hormones are acting on our cells and they are giving a message and they are getting the response. How do these cells do? Basically, the basic mechanism behind that is the cell signaling. So all the chemical activities or the physical activities, those are based on the cellular communication or the cell signaling. In cell signaling, basically there are 4 types of the cell signaling. Number 1 is the autocrine, number 2 is the extracrine, number 3 is the paracrine, and number 4 is the endocrine. First of all, what is the autocrine communication? Autocrine communication is such type of the communication in which cell that produces a signal and that signal will act on itself to get the response. Like this diagram, for example, here we have a cell and in the cell here we have a receptor. Now what will happen? This cell, inside the cell, a signal or a chemical that will be produced and that chemical will be released. After that, this chemical will bind to the receptor present on the same cell which is releasing to this chemical. So such type of the communication is named as autocrine communication or autocrine signaling. Number 2 is juxtacrine signaling. Juxtacrine signaling is very important. In juxtacrine signaling, what happened that the cells, they are connected to each other with the help of receptors and they communicate through that connection like this. Here we have a cell and here we have another cell. So here is the receptor of first cell and here is the receptor of other cell. So both of these cells, they are connected to each other at this point and they are communicating to each other through this connection. So such type of the communication is named as juxtacrine communication. And what about the paracrine communication? In the paracrine communication, this is also the same like that juxtacrine, but there is a one difference. In juxtacrine, these two cells, they are connected to each other, but in paracrine, cells are not connected to each other. And what happened in the paracrine? In the paracrine communication, the signal that will be released from one cell and that will act on the neighboring cell like this. In the diagram you can see, here we have one cell and this is a neighboring cell. This neighboring cell has a receptor like this. So this is the first cell and this one is the second cell. This one is the neighboring cell and here a signal will be produced, it will be given off and then it will be accepted by the neighboring cell. These are not connected to each other. So such type of the communication is named as paracrine communication. And the third one is the endocrine communication, which is very important in our body. In the endocrine communication, this is for the distant communication. Let me clear you one thing over here, that autocrine, juxtacrine and paracrine, this is for the local communication. This is not for the distant cells. For example, a signal is produced in our brain and it is coming. We can say that a signal is produced in our brain, our liver, and it is going to act on our legs or on our feet. This is not the local communication. This is the distant communication. What is the local communication? For example, we have an injury on our skin and the neighboring cells, they are producing the new cells in response to that injury. So such type of the communication is the local communication, and autocrine, dexacrine and paracrine, these are categorized under the heading of local communication, while endocrine, this is the distant communication. In distant communication, what happened that, for example, here we have cells and these are, for example, the blood vessels, and here we have other cells. So these cells, they will produce a signal, and these signals will be given off into the blood vessels in the blood like this, and then these signals, they will travel to the distant location, and then they will act on the target cells through their receptors like this. You can see in the diagram. So such type of the communication is named as endocrine communication. So this is all about the types of cell signaling. Now the next question or the next query is that how does this communication take place? First of all, for this communication we must know about the two things, and what are those two things? That is the, for example, those two things are, number one is ligands and number two is receptors. What are the ligands? All those chemicals that are acting as a stimuli. Those cells, those chemicals, they will be considered in the category of ligands. What about the these ligands can be of two types. Number one is hydrophobic and number two is hydrophilic. So these hydrophobic compounds and these hydrophilic compounds, mean hydrophobic are the water haters or water repellents, and hydrophilic compounds are the water lovers. What happened? For the hydrophilic compounds, we need receptors which are present on the surface of the cell, and for the hydrophobic compounds we don't need receptors present on the surface of cell, but we need the receptors inside the cell. So we can categorize these receptors in two ways. On the basis of these ligands, we can categorize these receptors as, for example, on basis of ligands, we can categorize these receptors into two categories. Number one is extracellular receptors, and number two is intracellular receptors. And what about these extracellular receptors and the intracellular receptors? Intracellular receptors are such type of the receptors that are present inside the cell, in the cytosol or in the nuclear membrane, and those are for the hydrophobic compounds, because we know very well that cell membrane is selectively permeable and it allows the hydrophobic compounds to pass through itself directly into the cytosol. So those hydrophobic compounds, they don't have any barrier to cross the cell, to come inside the cell. So when they come inside the cell, they need to get entry into the nuclear membrane, into the nucleus. So for that purpose they need intracellular receptors. I will show you in the diagram. And what about the extracellular receptors? Extracellular receptors, these are the surface receptors. We can categorize those receptors into three categories, or we can say that the receptors are categorized on the basis of their mechanism of action in three categories. That is same, you will, but it will be written differently in few books and differently in few books, but the basic mechanism or basic theme is the same. For example, for these extracellular receptors, these are categorized into three categories. For example, ionic channels, and for example, second one is enzyme-linked receptors, and the third one is GPCR, which means G protein coupled receptor. First of all, let me clear you or let me explain to you about these two receptors, then I will explain these three receptors individually. For example, here we have a diagram. We have a cell like this, and we know very well that in the cell we have the cell membrane like this. Like this, and here we have the nuclear membrane, and here is the DNA. So first of all, what about the extracellular receptors? Extracellular receptors, we have two types of the ligands, as I have told you, hydrophobic and hydrophilic. This one is our hydrophobic compound, and this one is a hydrophilic compound. So first of all, here it is hydrophobic, and this one is hydrophilic. What will happen? This hydrophobic, this will not be rejected by this selectively permeable membrane. It will get entry directly into the cell. So it is now inside the cell because it is hydrophobic in nature. And what we have here, we have in the cytosol, we have, for example, we have a receptor which may be present on the nuclear membrane or may be present in the cytosol. This receptor, now we have a complex, receptor ligand complex. This will come and get entered into the nucleus. After getting entry into the nucleus, it will get attached to a particular region that we name as HRE, hormone response element. After binding with this hormone response element, it will form messenger RNA. That messenger RNA will come out into the cytosol and will give the new proteins. So this is for the hydrophobic compounds. I am explaining this once again, that hydrophobic compounds, they will not be rejected by the cell membrane. They will have no membrane barrier. They will get enter into the cytosol. After coming inside the cytosol or inside the cytoplasm, there will be a receptor, either it is in the cytoplasm or it is attached to the nuclear membrane, so we name them as nuclear receptors. That there will be the formation of a complex that we name as receptor ligand complex, and this complex will go into the nuclear membrane inside the nucleus, and after coming inside the nucleus, that ligand will get attached to the hormone response element present on the DNA. And after that, there will be the formation of messenger RNA, and then messenger RNA will translocate from the nucleoplasm to the cytoplasm, and it will form the protein by a process translation. That was about the hydrophobic compounds. But what about the hydrophilic compounds? What will they do? Hydrophilic compounds, they need a receptor. They need to convey their message, to transmit their message from outside of the cell to inside of the cell, either till the cytoplasm or to the nucleus to form the new proteins. So how will they do? They need a receptor on the surface of the membrane, and those receptors are named as like this. Let me like this. Those receptors can be GPCR receptors, can be enzyme-linked receptors, or can be ionic channels. So when this will bind to the receptor which is present over here inside the cell membrane, on the surface of the cell membrane, which we are naming as extracellular receptor or the surface receptor, after binding with this receptor will transfer its message to inside the cytosol like this. Here I am writing only as the message, and this message will go to the nucleus and same again bind with the HRE, hormone response element. Then there will be the formation of messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA will come outside the nucleoplasm into the cytoplasm and will be translated into the proteins. Or the second pathway can be this message is transferred and inside the cytoplasm, and there will be the response like you can see in the here. So this is about the extracellular receptor and the intracellular receptor. As a whole, if we talk about the cellular communication, I have told you that basically we must have a stimuli. That stimuli should be detected with the help of a receptor, and that receptor then should give the signal toward the coordinator, either the coordinator of the cell or the coordinator of the party, and then the response will take place like this. Here we have a ligand, here we have a receptor, it is being attached to the receptor, then signal is coming. Here we have proteins, and here we have response. This is the basic theme of the cellular communication, that a ligand comes, a stimuli come, and I have told you about the ligands. Ligands are the hydrophobic or the hydrophilic, and when ligand attached to the receptor or comes inside the cell, that ligand will activate a few proteins, and those few proteins will give signal either to the DNA or they will give the response. And about the hydrophilic and hydrophobic, I have explained you the whole mechanism, that how hydrophobic compounds they act and how hydrophilic compounds they act. Hydrophobic, they are very simple, like for example steroid hormones, they just coming to the cell, getting entry without any rejection into the cell, and that after that they are activating the nuclear membrane, in the nucleus the hormone response element, and giving off the proteins, or helping in formation of new proteins, or in activation of few enzymes. That depends on the cell, that what function that cell has to perform and what type of the ligand has come to induce or to get a response. This totally depends on the ligand and the cell location. And second thing, I have told you about the hydrophilic compound. That hydrophilic compound, they attach on the surface of the membrane with the surface receptors, and then the signal is transferred inside the cell. Now the main thing is about these surface receptors. What are those surface receptors? Those surface receptors are the extracellular receptors. I have told you there are three types of the surface receptors: ionic channels, enzyme-linked channels, and GPCR. They will act differently. They will give their signal inside the cell with a different mechanism, with a different pathway. So this communication, either this communication is with the help of extracellular receptor, with the intracellular receptor, what type of the communication is, what type of the mechanism is, that is decided by the autocrine, extracrine, paracrine and endocrine communication. Now I will explain you about the ionic channels, that what are the ionic channels, then what are the enzyme-linked receptors, and what are the GPCR, G protein coupled receptor. Let me erase this to make it very simple for you. Now, first of all, ionic channels. Again, here we have a for example, we have a cell membrane. Here we have a ionic channel that is closed. Second, enzyme-linked receptor. Here we have a cell membrane. Like this. Like this. And the third one, like this. So whenever a ligand comes, that attach it with these we can say that channels, and after being attached to these channels will become open like this. Here these ions are ligands. They are coming and getting attached to these ionic channels. These are also named as voltage gated channels. It depends upon the electrical conductivity or the electrical potential. And when these become attached to these channels will become open. Here these channels are closed and here these channels are open, and after being open there will be the transport of ions either inside the cell or outside the cell. That depends upon the cell and its function. Second one is the enzyme-linked receptor. In enzyme-linked receptor, whenever there comes a ligand like this, whenever there comes a ligand, that ligand will activate that receptor, and then the inner domain, this domain will act as enzyme. So they have enzymatic activity. So we can say that these receptors are linked with enzymatic activity, so that's why they are named as enzyme-linked receptors. And the third one is GPCR. Here these are ionic channels. Here these are enzyme-linked, and then we have GPCR. In GPCR, what happened that in GPCR we have a helical portion. of the receptor, and those receptors are also named as 7 helices or 7 transmembrane receptors, because this receptor has 7 helical portions like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And whenever there comes a ligand, that ligand will become attached to this receptor, and after being attached to this receptor, there will be a change, and that change will be transferred to a protein that we name as G protein. This receptor will activate a G protein, and this one is, we can say, they act like a couple. They can't live without itself, without they can't be separated. We can say that if there is no G protein, GPCR will never work. If there is a G protein, then GPCR will work. So that's why they named as G protein coupled receptor, because this receptor is working on the basis of G protein, and there must be a G protein to work. And this is these are the 3 types of the receptors. In these receptors, you will find 3 things that are very common. What are those things? Those things are, which are very common, we have extracellular domain, we have transmembrane domain, and then we have cytosolic domain. So in these 3 receptors, you will find 3 things which are very common like this: the domain, the protein portion, or the receptor portion which is outside the cell, that is the extracellular domain, like this you can see over here, and the domain or the portion which is spanning inside the lipid bilayer, that portion is the transmembrane domain, and the portion which is inside the cytosol, that is named as cytosolic domain. Like this ionic channel you can see, this is the extracellular domain, transmembrane domain, and cytosolic domain. And in case of enzyme-linked receptors, you have here extracellular domain, transmembrane domain, and we have a cytosolic domain. Same with the case of this GPCR, we have a extracellular domain, then we have a transmembrane domain, and then we have a cytosolic domain. So whenever there will the binding of the ligand, there will be a conformational change, and that conformational change will be responsible for the transduction or the transmission of the signal inside the cell till the nucleus or till the enzymes or proteins which are already present in the cytosol. So I think you are very clear about this, that what is the basis of cell signaling. Like for example, I will give you a very brief review. For example, that you must know about the types of cell signaling: autocrine, extracrine, paracrine, and then endocrine. After that, you must know about the ligands. What are the ligands? Ligands can be hydrophobic, can be hydrophilic. And then on the basis of these ligands, we have 2 categories of the receptors: intracellular receptors and extracellular receptors. Hydrophobic, they don't need any barrier, they just get entered into the cytosol. And for the hydrophobic compound, we have intracellular receptors, and for the hydrophilic compounds which have a barrier to enter in the cell, the cell. So for those hydrophilic compounds, we have the receptors present on the cell surface, and those receptors are extracellular receptors. And I have told you about the ionic channels. These are 3 types of the receptors: ionic channels, enzyme-linked receptors, and the G protein coupled receptors. And this is the general mechanism for the hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Hydrophobic directly entering into the cell, and hydrophilic through the surface receptors. And then about these 3 receptors you must know: ionic channels for the opening and closing of channels for the transport, and enzyme-linked receptors. In enzyme-linked receptor, they have enzymatic activity and GPCR. And in these 3 receptors, the 3 domains: extracellular domain, transmembrane domain, and cytosolic domain. So this is the basics of the cell signaling.